Today on the show, we're going to be looking at Thor, the god of thunder. If you didn't know, at one point in his life, his memories were erased and he was forced to live as a human, then this video is for you. So Thor, the blood son of Odin, father of all the Asgardians, and Jord, one of the elder gods who is also known as Gaia. So Odin wanted to have a son whose powers came from both Asgard and Earth. So he got freaky with Jord, and she gave birth to Thor in a cave that Odin created in Norway. And then after a few months, Odin took Thor and went off to Asgard to have Thor raised there. Odin's wife Frigga would act as Thor's mother through his life, and it wasn't until much later in Thor's life that he found out that Frigga wasn't his birth mother. So as a child, Thor was raised with Loki. Now, Loki was being raised by Odin because Loki's frost giant father was killed in battle, and Loki would be jealous of Thor for most of their childhood, and I mean, who wouldn't be? Because, you know, young Thor was, right up in young adult, he was, pleasant to look at. Anyway, this jealousy evolved into hate, and this hate evolved into a want to kill Thor. And obviously, this impulsion to kill Thor kind of lasted centuries, and is featured in many, many forms of media, featuring the two characters. A good example of this was when Thor was 8. You see, Odin sent Thor to the land of the dwarves, Nidvallir, to get the dwarves to make 3 treasures for the ruler of Asgard. One of these 3 treasures, of course, was the Uru hammer Mjolnir. Now, Loki actually distracted the dwarven weaponsmith, so he actually made the handle for Mjolnir way too short. So when Thor returned the hammer to Odin, Odin enchanted the hammer so it was only capable of being used by someone who was worthy of using it. And then he said, I'm reserving this hammer for Thor, so he will be able to use this hammer when he's done acts of selfless and valor, and when he's become an all-round hip and groovy guy. Thor, of course, didn't really understand this or get it because he was so youthful and naive, and he just worked on becoming physically strong enough to pick up the hammer. Thor eventually became Asgard's greatest warrior, and he also fell in love with the goddess Sif. Now, Sif was eventually kidnapped by some frost giants and taken to the goddess Hela. And Thor said to Hela, look, you can have my life, just let Sif go free. And Hela goes, that is a really hip and groovy thing of you to do, so you can both go free. Sometime in the 9th century, Thor wrote his travels to Earth and managed to convince the Vikings to worship the Asgardian gods. He also taught the Norsemen and the Germans to find glory in the art of war. However, when he found out that a group of Norsemen slaughtered a Christian monastery in his name, he felt so disgusted at himself and at humanity that he just left. So of course, with no actual Asgardian gods on Earth, their presence quickly went from being fact, to being a legend, to being a myth. So according to the severed eye of Odin, so remember to take this with a grain of salt, Thor was actually once turned into the Germanic heroes Sigmund and Siegfried. So apparently, Odin turned Thor into Sigmund to retrieve the powerful ring Nibelung, but the warrior king Hunding killed Thor before he could do this, so Thor was reborn into Siegfried. Siegfried managed to get a hold of the ring after defeating the giant Fafnir, who was disguised as a dragon. So Siegfried then fell in love with the Valkyrie Brunhilde. However, this didn't last long because he was then killed by the dwarf Hagen, who was the son of the dwarf that created the ring. Odin then resurrected Siegfried as Thor, but without any of his memories of ever being a human. So Adolf Hitler managed to contact Thor and tricked him into helping the Germans in the war. And this obviously made Thor come in contact with the invaders. And Thor actually almost killed the second Union Jack. However, Thor was able to learn that Hitler was evil, and he extracted all the electricity from Union Jack, which gave Union Jack the ability to discharge electricity at will. Following the war, Thor was obviously a bit bitter about being tricked by a human, so he didn't really return to Earth all that often, only really when the Olympians asked for his help, which led to this weird little adventure which made him work with Loki, and it involved a sultan. But it also led to Thor breaking a truce between the Frost Giants and the Asgardians. So breaking this truce caused a war, and this was the last straw. Mid-battle, Odin contacted Thor and was like, "You're coming to see me now for a chat." Which, you know, when your dad asks you for a chat, that's never good. Odin decided that this time Thor was going to learn humility and it was going to stick. He was sent to Earth as a crippled medical student called Donald Blake, and he was stripped of his hammer and stripped of his memory. As Donald, Thor learnt the values of perseverance and how to care for others. He'd also start as a medical student and go on to be a very, very respected physician with his own private practice in New York. So 10 years quickly passed, and Odin planted an idea in Donald's mind to go on vacation in Norway. And while in Norway, Donald ran into like these aliens, and these aliens were from Saturn, and they totally freaked Donald out. So he ran into this nearby cave, and this cave was the very same cave that Thor had been given birth to thousands upon thousands of years ago. Odin had left Thor's hammer in the cave in the form of a wooden cane, and as Donald ran into the cave, a boulder shifted and trapped him in there. Out of frustration, Donald hit the boulder with the wooden cane, and he transformed into Thor, all magical girl style. Now he had his godly form back, he was able to escape the cave and drive off the aliens and send them packing back to Saturn. So at first, Thor had no memory of his Asgardian heritage. However, the more months passed, the more would slowly come back to him. And after a few years, Odin came to Earth and said to Thor, "Look, I sent you to Earth to learn how to be hip and groovy. I can now see that you are the hippest and the grooviest, so you can come back to Asgard if you want." But Thor just said, "No thanks." One of the reasons Thor decided to stay on Earth was because he had learned to love humanity that much that he wanted to be with them as much as possible. And the other reason was because he had subconsciously realised that half his heritage was from Earth. This being said, he did learn how to split his time between Asgard and Earth. It's super effective! So for years, Thor was in love with this woman called Jane Foster, who worked as a nurse at his doctor's practice. Odin totally disapproved of this relationship and refused to give Jane any immortality, and he even set Loki on Jane to get Enchantress on her to try and split up the relationship. So Thor would eventually reveal his true identity to Jane. However, this caused Odin to temporarily remove Thor's powers again. Their relationship eventually came to an end on its own, and Thor would get back together with Sif. So Loki, who was still jealous of Thor, gradually began to manipulate various happenings around the world. And this led to the Hulk being let loose, and a group of heroes had to team up to stop him. This is how Thor became a founding member of the Avengers. So eventually an alien called Beta Ray Bill came to Earth, and he had the ability to use Thor's hammer, and Odin was like, "Right, you need a hammer of your own." So he took the enchantment out of Thor's hammer and created another hammer out of it. Of course, this removed Thor's ability to turn into the mortal Donald Blake. This didn't prove to be too much of an issue, because Thor just worked with S.H.I.E.L.D. and they created another persona called Sigurd Jarlsson, and he just wore mortal clothes and glasses, and he wasn't actually mortal in his form, but he dressed like it and everything was fine. So there are, of course, a number of adventures that would be important to mention here, but I think I should highlight Thor and Thunderstrike. So Thor merged with this human called Eric Matteson using his hammer, and it was a bit like his Donald Blake persona before, where the two swapped consciousness. So Loki would attempt to kill the woman who took care of Eric's kids, and Thor, in response, would kill Loki. As a punishment, Thor was exiled from Earth and the role of Thunder God was given to Eric. So eventually Eric was able to find Thor in his own subconsciousness and rescue Thor from exile. And because Eric had proven himself as a hero countless times by this point, Odin gave him a mace called Thunderstrike. Eric would fight as a hero called Thunderstrike until he was eventually killed by the Egyptian god Set. So Odin was eventually killed in a battle with Surtur, and Asgard would be left without a leader. Thor eventually accepted the position and accepted his father's Odin powers, thus making him a lot more powerful. And he became obsessed with trying to get the people of Earth to worship the Asgardians again. So to do this, he merged Earth with Asgard. Thor's increased activity on Earth resulted in him getting a lot of followers and the Church of Thor being made. However, his willingness to help his followers resulted in him going head-to-head against his fellow Avengers when they tried to overthrow the government of Slovakia.
It's super effective!
So eventually the humans would become scared of Thor and the Asgardians, and they launched a full-scale attack on Asgard, reducing it to nothing but rubble. Thor then travelled backwards in time and stopped the fusion from ever happening because he realised he done goofed. There was no time for peace though. You see, Loki teamed up with Surtur in an attempt to bring about Ragnarok. Again. Loki and Surtur were creating weapons from the same forge that Thor's hammer was created from. Thor would then find out that the gods of gods were manipulating the Asgardians so they'd repeat the Ragnarok cycle. So Thor gave his life to destroy the gods of gods. Just before Thor died, the Odin power manifested itself and said to Thor, "Congratulations, you've done what Odin, your father, has planned out for you." And then Thor was left to rest the slumber of gods. Obviously this isn't where Thor's story ends. You see, his hammer returned to Earth, and along the way it freed Doctor Doom from his extra-dimensional prison, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, back to the hammer in the field. So who should come along and claim the hammer but Donald Blake? Turns out he was brought back into existence when Odin died, and that undid the spell that erased him from existence. Meanwhile, while all this was going on, a Thor clone was released in a battle between pro and anti-resignation heroes, and this Thor clone killed Bill Foster! So Donald Blake returned to the Void and said to Thor, "Hey, you know you can come back if you want, right? I mean, it'll be painful, but, you know, if you can come back and restore all the people that you love." And then a horde of creatures began to enter the Void, and Donald Blake left after this, and Thor had to fight his way through these creatures, but at the end he saw his hammer, and he reached out and grabbed for it, and then a bolt of lightning hit him, knocking away all the remaining creatures, and then when he emerged he was on Earth, wearing a new costume that had 90% less spandex and about 70% more chainmail. So Thor used his hammer to recreate Asgard's capital in Oklahoma, and eventually he'd meet up with Iron Man in New Orleans, and Iron Man would be all like, "Hey, this Asgard on Earth thing that you're doing, you know, it's a nice idea, but no." And then Thor just responded, "No, that clone of me, you know, pretty fancy stuff, you know. I don't feel violated or anything, you know, that you used a clone of me to kill people that I saw as family. No, I don't feel violated at all." So the two finally came to an agreement where Asgard would be considered a foreign embassy and all its residents would be given diplomatic immunity. So Thor went out and found most of the Asgardians, but he made no attempt to find Odin. He had a vision where he learned on a subconscious level he kind of wanted to be free of his father, but he also learned that Odin was actually in an eternal battle with Surtur, where he'd die and be reborn every single day. Okay, so during the Siege of Asgard, which was an event where Norman Osborn led an attack on Asgard with the Dark Avengers, and Thor obviously tried to defend his people, but it was too late because by the time he had turned up, Norman said to the Siege, you know what, attack this place, and Asgard was destroyed before Thor's eyes. The Sentry then became possessed by the Void, and the Void went about attacking heroes until Loki used the Normstones to empower all the heroes. Obviously the Void quickly realised where this power was coming from, and he went forward and killed Loki. A really emotional scene here was when Loki apologised to Thor for everything he had done. He then died in Thor's arms. So everyone at this point was pissed, and Thor was attacking the Void at full force, but it wasn't doing anything until Tony Stark took the hammer helicarrier and rammed it straight into their opponent. This forced the Void to turn back into his human form, Rob Reynolds, and he was like, "Please kill me, Thor, please kill me right now." And Thor was like, "No, you'll pay for your crimes in prison." But he unwillingly began to turn back into the Void, so before he could reach his full power again, Thor summoned some lightning and told it to hit Rob right then and right there, leaving just a charred skeleton where the Void once was. Thor then wrapped his cape around the corpse and threw it into the sun, and some people say this was ceremonial to respect the body, but a lot of people also think that it was just in case that it turned back into the Void in a dead body, and obviously with no body to possess, the Void couldn't come back. So Thor would go on to revive Loki, even though he was a child and didn't have any of his memories. He would go on to revive Odin, and there was a lot of friction between the two of them. And he would go on to get the Odin sword, which his name was Ragnarok, and he would use that to fight a giant serpent and die while defeating said serpent. So Thor's corpse was burned, and a shape emerged out of the fire, and that shape was the new god of thunder, Tyrannus. And everyone acted as if Tyrannus had been there forever. He was always an Avenger. And only Loki seemed to realise, hold on a minute, he was just made. Thor used to be the god of thunder. You remember him? Blonde hair, pretty hip and groovy? Fortunately, at the same time, Thor's spirit awoke, and Donald Blake was made a completely separate entity from Thor. So Loki set out to restore everyone's memories and restore Thor from the afterlife. He contacted the Silver Surfer for help, and the two of them went to Blake and took his cane, which in turn transformed into Thor's hammer, which shot off to Thor and restored him from the afterlife, and Thor was able to protect Asgardia from an invasion of trolls, and he was also able to unmask Tyrannus as a disguised Ulik.
It's super effective!
So now we're at the Avengers vs X-Men, where Thor led 2 attacks on the Phoenix Force in space and failed miserably both times, so we're gonna act like this never happened. Okay, so most recently Thor heard a prayer of a little girl from an alien planet, and he went to said alien planet and said to one of the elders, "Hey, why didn't this little girl pray to one of your gods?" And this elder was like, "Well, we don't have any gods. We used to hear stories about gods in the sky, but no one believes those anymore." Thor found the home of that planet's gods, and he explored a bit and found all the gods had been dead for a really long time, and he was quickly able to identify this as the work of Gorr, the God Butcher. Thor looked into things and found that all the gods who had gone missing over the past 1,000 years had gone missing because Gorr had attacked them. He went to the last place where he had seen Gorr 1,000 years ago exactly, and found a person there who said that they were there because Gorr wasn't going to come there anytime soon, and that the reason Gorr was doing all this was because of Thor. Of course, there is way more to that story than that, but I want you to go out and read it. I don't care how you do it, if you buy the comic, if you borrow a friend's comic, but this character is so great that you need to read this comic. It's one of the best comics that I've read in a long, long time, probably second only to the Harley Quinn comic that came out just a few days ago. Honestly, it's worth your time and money to read this comic. Even if you only watch my series to learn about characters and you don't really read comics, pick up this one. It's great. It's amazing.
It's super effective!
So guys, that is it for today. Please remember to leave a comment down below about any gaps in Thor's history that I might have missed that you think should have been in this video. Also remember to thumbs up this video and subscribe. My name is Faust, this has been Exploring Comics, and it's super effective.